When I was a kid, I often wondered where the vernacular for the racial categorization in the United States came from. I mean, are white people really white, or are they more of a pinkish tan? Obviously, Asians don't have yellow skin, and Native Americans aren't really red, and black people aren't really the color black. However, one of my favorite groups on Earth to learn about that gets almost no attention in the Western world are the Nilotes of Sub-Saharan Africa, who almost appear to be a caricature of African features. The Nilotes are perhaps one of the most phenotypically unique people on the entire planet, with an almost universal appearance consisting of jet black skin, quite distinct facial features, and a tall and lanky frame, and even the Nilotic homeland in East Africa has a pretty cool shape. The features of this unique racial group is a consequence of their position and environment in the continent of Africa, lying in one of the hottest, most humid overall places in the world. And although there is no central unity among the Nilotes today, divided into countless subgroups, many had attained a strong presence in not only the history of Africa, but other parts of the world as well. So what exactly are the parameters for these Nilotic peoples? Why are they so distinct and of such great interest to human anthropologists? And what is the history behind the envoys and empires from this unique group of people that have been greatly neglected in the academic world? Naturally, the name for the Nilotic people, as well as the greater Nilo-Saharan language family, is derived from the Nile River, which is of course one of the longest in the world, stretching from Egypt and snaking its way down to Lake Victoria in the middle of East Africa, with the Nilotes mostly centered around the White Nile and the fertile plains that surround it. Nilotes are the eastern half of the Nilo-Saharan peoples, which in itself is a bit of a dubious classification, as it's incredibly difficult to classify many supposed Nilo-Saharan languages similar to the Khoisan family, and hence they're grouped together mostly for convenience sake, and it's been proposed that the group as a whole may actually be related to either the Niger-Congo or Afro-Asiatic language families, although no widely accepted conclusion has been accepted, either from an anthropological or linguistic view. The Nilotic group proper is spread out over several East African countries, but especially in South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, and they are believed to have originated in the Upper Nile some 3,000 years ago, and gradually spread south over the millennia, and most Nilotes have specific genetic markers such as haplogroup A and B, which are linked to other pre-Bantu populations of sub-Saharan Africa such as the Pygmy and Khoi. The unique phenotype of the Nilotes can be attributed as a genetic adaptation to their environment, as lacking in body hair, their skin is the primary defense from UV radiation, absorbing most of the sunlight with its extremely dark color, while their tall and slender frame is an adaptation that allows their bodies to expel heat quicker in the hot, humid savanna of Africa, as most know that thermal energy is radiated quicker as surface area increases in proportion to volume. Although studies do vary, the average Nilote is around 6'2", being 6'4" for males and 6 foot for females, and records show that the Nilotes of South Sudan were actually even taller in the past than they are today, mainly because of malnutrition caused by famine and war. But even today, it's not uncommon to see men and women that dwarf over other African peoples and nearly every other group on Earth, and this lanky frame clearly gives them an edge in competitive athletic events. Among athletes from Kenya and Uganda, Nilotic peoples are extraordinarily overrepresented in sports and other athletic events, with over 75% of Kenyan and Ugandan athletes at the Olympics belonging to this racial group. And this is also true for countries in which Nilotes make up a smaller share of the population, such as in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Southern Nilotes from Kenya and Uganda generally have less pronounced features than their northern counterparts. For example, they might not have the same telltale jet black skin and are on average ever so slightly shorter by a couple inches while still being incredibly tall, and this is most likely due to admixture from Bantus and Horn Africans. The Maasai, being the southernmost group, are still easily categorized into the Nilotic group, yet also have considerable admixture from Bantus and especially ancient Cushitic migrants, which can be seen in their unique facial features somewhat reminiscent of Somalis and Ethiopians. Because the Nilo-Saharan language family is quite poorly attested, it is difficult to ascertain which peoples in this group are part of the Nilotic family proper, and the Nubian language is considered to be closely related to the Nilotic end of the spectrum, only lying further north along the Nile, and is actually presently completely isolated from any other Nilo-Saharan group. The Nubians were well known in the ancient world in both the east and the west, establishing the kingdom of Kush in the 8th century BC, and the Nubian language is actually the oldest known recorded language of sub-Saharan Africa. Kush was a monarchy that lasted nearly 1,000 years and even briefly invaded and conquered the Egyptians in the 7th century BC until being expelled by the Assyrians. The Nubians were also one of the few African peoples that converted to Orthodox Christianity, having done so in the 6th century AD, and this led to the formation of the Kingdom of Makuria, a Christian Nubian kingdom that was able to repel the Islamic invasions from the north, which had already conquered all of Egypt and the Maghreb. Makuria stretched as far north as Luxor and Aswan at its height, although gradually lost territory to the Islamic armies before eventually being completely absorbed by the Mamluks of Egypt, followed by the Ottoman Turks in the 1400s. Following this conquest, virtually the entirety of the surviving Nubian community was either willingly or forcibly converted to the Islamic faith, and this left Ethiopia as the last great Christian power in the continent of Africa at the time. Although the Nubians are still around today in Egypt and Sudan, they are heavily mixed with the surrounding Arabs, and most speak Arabic as a second language. Although the Hutu and Tutsi of Rwanda and Burundi are both considered Bantu groups by most anthropologists today and speak dialects of the same Rwanda-Rundi language, these two groups are ethnically distinct from each other, and although they have been separated for hundreds of years, there has been intermarriage between the two for many generations. When the Germans and Belgians first stumbled upon this region of East Africa in the 18th century, they recognized the Tutsis as ethnically and phenotypically distinct, as the Tutsi are considerably taller than the Hutu on average and have more of what the Belgians called Caucasian features, and seeing how they were already a dominant minority in the regions, the Belgians placed them in charge of the new colony. Interestingly, the Tutsi do have a slightly different genetic makeup than their Hutu counterparts, which owes to admixture from other sub-Saharan racial groups, and the slight difference in appearance and the historical dominance of the Tutsis is what led to the tragic genocides in the late 20th century. Although historians vary on the subject, a good chunk of the ancestors of the Tutsi arrived in Rwanda sometime in the past 500 to 1,000 years from the north, and it's been shown through genetic studies that the Tutsi do have considerable admixture from both the Nilotes, which would explain the great height differentials, and the Kushites, which would explain the Horn African facial features, although there is considerable overlap with the neighboring Hutu people, and over time the Tutsis dropped their original Nilo-Saharan or Afro-Asiatic language, but were still culturally and politically dominant in the region, even establishing their own kingdom as early as the 15th century, despite never making up more than 15% of the population. Therefore, it can be concluded that groups like the Maasai and the Tutsi are somewhat hybrid populations in the region of East Africa, and these groups even have legends about how their ancestors came from the north hundreds of years ago in order to conquer in the case of the Tutsis, and in order to settle in the case of the Maasai. Historically, many Nilo-Saharan peoples were assimilated into Afro-Asiatic groups, especially the advancing Arabs from the north, which is why the vast majority of the Sudanese Arab population has some degree of Nilo-Saharan admixture, either from Nubian, Fur, or Nilotic extraction, as well as heavy admixture from the neighboring Horn African peoples, and this is also true for Arabs in southern Egypt to a lesser degree. Due to these racial and linguistic differences, the Nilo-Saharan peoples of Sudan found themselves to be the victims of harsh discrimination by the Sudanese government in the 20th century, which of course led to the formation of the world's newest internationally recognized country, South Sudan. Other than race and language, one of the primary factors in the split in Sudan was due to the religious and cultural differences, as Sudanese Arabs are overwhelmingly practitioners of Sunni Islam, while Islam never really took hold in the Nilotic inhabitants of the south. Up until very recently, the Nilotic peoples of Sudan still held on to various animistic beliefs, being one of the last regions of Africa yet to be Christianized. However, in the past 2 to 3 decades, there has been an explosion of Christianity among these peoples, jumping from 15% to over 70% in only a generation, and this was one of the main catalysts for the independence of South Sudan, along with severe discrimination towards the Nilotes by the Sudanese government. By compiling many sources on the matter, we are actually able to come to the conclusion that currently over 80% of the Nilotic population of all countries are adherents of Christianity, split between Protestants and Catholics at a ratio of about 2 to 1, while a small minority, around 3%, practices Islam, 14% still hold on to traditional animistic religions, and only a very small minority are irreligious, although the percentage of Nilotes that actively blend Christianity and indigenous beliefs is likely far higher than is implied. The area with the largest Nilotic population are the 3 countries of Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan, all at over 10 million each, although smaller numbers still exist in the peripheries of Sudan and Ethiopia, and drooping down into Tanzania. Large numbers of refugees fleeing the war-torn South Sudan are also present in other African countries, as well as a community nearly 150,000 strong in North America, and far smaller numbers in Europe and Australia, adding up to 45 million people, although Sudan is currently the only Nilotic majority country. Even so, it still amazes me that the Nilotic people are not given sufficient attention in other parts of the world, considering their extremely unique history, physiology, and genetics, which has influenced and been influenced by many other groups around them. So next time you watch the Olympics or any marathon from almost any country in the world, pay attention to where the competitors are from. Chances are you will recognize this people group almost immediately. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts on the Nilotes and other related peoples such as the Nubians, and as always, thank you all for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.